Hello, my name is Devin Smith, and I'm going to be talking to you today about episode 1 of season 2 of Longmire. Right here we see the first sort of introduction of native ideas. Well, if you're not familiar with native ideas, it's not really apparent at first, but later on in the episode, which we'll go to shortly, it'll be apparent when the white buffalo begins to cross momentarily and what sort of significance that holds to the rest of the episode. See right here, Longmire points out that the buffalo's guarding something as it crosses the road.
How common is that, Paul?
As she asks, how common is that?
About 1 in every 10.
And the convict, who has not talked at all until just now, sort of sees a point of emphasis with the white buffalo crossing.
Right, Sheriff?
Talking about its significance and how rare it is and what it could potentially mean. That's a little bit of foreshadowing, what I like to call.
Go.
So we come back at this point in the story. This is actually later on in the story. The convict and Sheriff Longmire are wrestling, and they're talking actually about the significance of the white buffalo that was seen earlier. The convict actually believes it was a sign for him that led him to want to escape, leading him to believe he would be successful if he did escape. However, in a moment, Sheriff Longmire is about to rebuke him and saying that no, the sign was actually not for him. It was for all the native people he had killed. And it was a sign that he would no longer be living, basically. And just to sort of wrap up what my thoughts are on this whole exchange, this idea of buffalo, white buffalo, this idea of signs, I don't know if it's really a fair comparison to say that this is something that people should take as native from this film. I already feel like there's sort of this affinity for sort of being one with nature, sort of romanticizing natives, if you will. So I don't know if this is actually a fair sort of thing people should take, but it's a thing that they're going to take from it anyway. If you watch this episode and you were asked what's one native part of this episode, it would definitely be the scene with the white buffalo. So right now we're in season 2, episode 2 of Longmire, and Vic and Longmire are investigating a murder that's related to a turkey burger. And this scene might seem minimal at first, but they go to Henry and ask him if he has ever served turkey at his restaurant. And he states plainly, never have, never will. And then when Vic inquires further, Longmire explains about Thanksgiving, and Henry replies, "You mean Thanks-taking?" And I think that humor is sort of important because it kind of encapsulates true native humor, at least in my perspective, because I could absolutely see that being a sort of point of conversation.
So this episode of Longmire is called The Road to Hell. Cattle are being stolen from a truck that was left on the side of the road with multiple bullet shots in it. The driver is missing, and Vic and Waltz tries to solve the mystery of the missing cattle and driver. Their driver eventually turns up dead, and some of the cattle is found strolling in town with animal rights activism signs on them, like the beef industry is destroying the planet. Meanwhile, flowers are delivered to Vic at work, but the sender is unknown, and the episode ends when Vic says, "They found me." So in this scene, Walt and Vic are questioning an activist they suspect of being involved. While he denies being the murderer, he says that he supports the act of freeing the cattle. He then tries to connect with Henry with their supposed shared goal of saving and respecting the earth, calling him brother. Henry is not excited and responds with a sarcastic, "I suppose." And I think that this scene is very, very racist. So in this episode of Longmire, it's called Tell It Slant. And in this episode, Walt and Vic finds a native woman dead in her home. They believe that Aaron, her brother, was the killer due to the fact that he rode past Walt's house earlier on a horse, as Aaron thinks that he's a contrary warrior. This indicates a nearby death before anyone else knew. In this scene, Walt confronts Aaron, and it turns out that he's a schizophrenic and a drunk, and he snapped and killed his sister. for not supporting him being a contrary warrior. The issues in this episode was Native Americans' mental health and health in general being ignored and untreated, which leads to further issues with alcohol and drug abuse.
So in this episode of Longmire, Sound and Fury, Walt is interviewing this man that Henry overheard at his bar plotting to kill his wife. The man was asking another man to kill his wife. The man refused. Henry asked the man if he could kill his wife just to see what was going on, to maybe stop the killing from happening completely. And when the man was confronted about that night, he refuses the story and accuses Henry of being a liar. He says you can't trust him because he's Native American, and pretty much says it's your word versus mine. And I think that kind of just goes with the whole theme of natives and that we can't be trusted and that we're trying to trick people all the time, and that's just a theme in Hollywood movies in general. In this episode, called Tuscan Red, a Cheyenne man named Ethan is found in the ruins of his brother's trailer after a gas leak explosion. In this scene, Walt is informing his wife that her husband has died, and she tells him about the struggles that they have had coming back to the res, like Ethan's family not accepting her because she is black. They won't accept her as a part of their family. They won't even let her have the rights to his body just because she has a different color to her skin. And this is quite sad, but honestly I have seen this same situation go on in the reservation that I have lived, and it's amazing how judgmental people are in the res because of people's skin color. It affects everyone, not just this isn't. So I kind of related to this scene.
Alright, so in episode 10, at the end of the episode, Katie is in the hospital after a hit and run accident, and Walt is feeling out of balance with the world, with Katie, with all of everything, and so he decides that the way to fix that is to do a vision quest, and that involves him going out into the desert and having 2 giant fish hooks embedded in his chest, having those hooks tied to a pole several yards away, and then hanging there just for fun for a while. He asks Henry's help to do this, and while Henry is initially reluctant, he approves of Walt's dedication to helping Katie. I would generally dismiss this as another example of Walt using his pseudo-native status / spirituality, which I'm generally not thrilled about, but I let go. But in this case, when he originally asked Henry, he specifically says that this is something that is not something a white man is supposed to be doing. The fact that he does it anyway, just because Henry gave his blessing, is a little bit frustrating, because having 1 or 2 or even 10 people in a minority group say that something is okay and using their culture like that is okay does not necessarily make it all right. And Walt seems to abuse the "I have a native friend and he says that's fine" excuse a lot, and even more frustratingly, Henry generally supports it as well after a token resistance at the start. Alright, so in this scene of episode 11, Henry, Walt, and a local hunter are trying to hunt down a poacher, and in the process they kind of lampshade an issue that Native people, but also all minorities have. Henry's leg goes into a trap, and he says that it's an OIT, which stands for Old Indian Trick. And the hunter that they're working with is very confused because he says that Henry's an Indian. Henry is understandably annoyed and snaps that he's Cheyenne, while this particular trap is an Apache trick, which he could have noticed if he had been paying attention. This kind of subtly points out that there are multiple different Native groups, and the differences aren't just in the name alone. And like I said before, this issue applies to all minority groups, in the concept that everybody who is Asian or African or whatever speaks the same language and has the same beliefs or dress or anything like that. But it's particularly difficult for Native people because their divisions are not commonly portrayed even in historical education, and particularly not in modern maps or politics.
So do y'all think that this is a Native show?
Well, I think that it does a really good job in terms of showing Native issues. There are natives portrayed in the show. There are Native issues portrayed in the show. I mean, you could argue some of the things like in my episodes, the white buffalo, that kind of like over dramatizes the issue of the white buffalo. I don't know a lot of Native people who are like see white buffaloes and like, oh, change, something dramatic's going to happen. We just seen a white buffalo. It certainly has some problems in some areas, but I think Longmire does an adequate job to not be written by all natives in terms of, just looking at Native issues. So I think it's a start for being a Native show.
Yeah, I would say that I don't think that it's a Native show, but it does discuss Native issues well. It doesn't focus on Native people often enough, particularly in this season, for it to be considered a Native show, because it just, as we know, having watched this season in particular detail, there were only like 3 or 4 at most episodes that were specifically centered on Native people. Otherwise, it was either the local townspeople or it was, other minority groups like illegal immigrants and such, which are not bad issues to discuss, and there's a lot of intersectionality on that, but it does, in my mind, make this non-Native.
So the biggest issue for me that I saw in this season, well, the most important issue that I saw was on episode 9 when it touched on the interracial marriage within the reservation. I thought it was pretty important that it gave a different perspective. Usually you see white communities being discriminatory against interracial marriage or something like that. We're used to seeing that, but I think it was good to see that even like the smallest of minorities can be discriminate against other minorities, and there are problems within all communities.
So some of the issues that I saw was like Native Americans being depicted as drug abusers, they're abusive to other people, or they're not good parents and have anger problems, and then whites being seen as heroes and good parents who will never abandon their child or allow them to do drugs. And Native Americans, they're not being depicted as people that, are moral and, have honest careers. So.
I do agree with all of that, although I think that a lot of the times the show does work to subvert those examples, such as with the white mother and the Native mother. The white mom ended up being the murderer, and even though the Native mother was not necessarily always at home baking cookies or anything for her child, she does do her best to support her, and she takes care of her younger sister like a parent as well. So I think by the end of the show, a lot of times it's been turned around to show that the stereotype that they were initially portraying as being true is sometimes a unclear issue.
And I think I would just follow up on like what's been said previously, like sort of the romanticism, interracial marriage. But I do see your point, Jordan, how the show sort of intentionally creates that contrast by saying, well, trying to point that out, saying it's not, it's not romanticized. This is not a real thing. So that was the only point, really thing I seen through watching the episode, would just sort of like romanticize the issues. But I do see your point on how the show sort of points that out, just to say that's a problem. So. So the next questions we're going to tackle are, what would the rating we each give for Longmire be as far as Native American representation goes, and just a few likes and dislikes. So I'll go first. So if I had to rate Longmire from 1 to 10, I would give it a solid 7.8 out of 10. And some of the likes and dislikes I had, because I like the fact that there's a Native representation in all the show. I mean, it's hard pressed to find other Netflix originals that kind of have at least some influence of Native culture or Native issues or Native ideas in the show. But I guess this kind of leads into my dislike, or is that sort of the next step? Well, how exactly are they portrayed in that show? And that's what, we've talked previously about some of the issues that are in the show, the representation. So that would be my only concern moving forward, is that it's sort of authentic, whatever that means, representation of Native Americans.
So for my rating, I would probably give it maybe around a 6. I liked this show, but I felt like it still was dominated by the white culture. I think that natives were represented pretty well, but when Henry talked, he still talked like that wise native, and that was kind of annoying at points. I really liked how it gave some native representation and a native perspective at some things you never get a native perspective on.
Yeah, I didn't like how Henry talked. He talked so proper. And I could agree with you, Scott. Like, it's still dominated by like a white culture. And as far as rating the show, as far as a representation for Native Americans, I still don't feel like I know how Native Americans should be represented, because after I saw Junktown's Finest, it's like I saw drug abuse, I saw all of this stuff in Junktown's Finest, and it's like that's supposed to be like a real scenario or a real representation of Native Americans. So I would rate it maybe like a 5, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the show in general is maybe a 6, and for representation, probably a 4 or 5. Just because, it does cover Native issues, but at least for this particular season, there aren't a lot of Native-centered episodes, and, the main Native character is not played by a Native person, which kind of argues against, great representation. And like Kim said, and Scott, his speech is very stilted and kind of stereotypical, even if at times he manages to, be less stoic and more just a normal person, I guess. That sounds bad, but... And then my other main issue with the show is just Walt's general kind of cultural appropriation. He doesn't wander around in headdresses or anything, but he does insert himself into Native culture in a way that I'm not sure is appropriate, even given the level of acceptance that is given on the show. And I'm not sure that he would receive that same level of acceptance in real life. He seems to be in on a lot of native rituals and such and hold a lot of native symbols close to his heart, even though he doesn't have his own particular connection to them.
You were about to attack me because I couldn't pause it.
Oh, sorry.